Hey guys, we are back updating the power rankings for the Traitors US Season 2 following episode 5, or the third week of episodes. And this was a very eventful episode, a lot of stuff coming down the road for the season, and pretty interesting stuff in terms of the actual rankings. Now, obviously, we did get the addition of Kate, which means I will be including her in this week's power ranking, meaning there will be 15 players to talk about in this week's power ranking. And let's not waste any more time, let's get right into the video. So starting off at number 15, we have the first spoof from this week, and here we have Tamra. And this isn't too shocking, as I was pretty low on Tamra for pretty much the entire season. She didn't really bring much to the table, and her going out here as this easy target kind of makes sense here. Obviously taken out by the Traitors in order to create confusion. In general, I am kind of glad she's out of the game, as she wasn't really bringing much to the table, though with Kate's inclusion, I guess Kate will just fill Tamra's spot, but obviously Tamra is now out of the game, which is why she's here at number 15. Now moving on to number 14, and we have the other boot from this week, and here we have Janelle. And it's kind of weird, as I always expected Janelle to be a relatively early target, even though she wasn't that low on my previous power rankings, as we literally see Janelle across a lot of her Big Brother career being this big target, where on BB7 she was targeted during a lot of that season. BB14 she was also a relatively early boot and someone who was a big target coming into that. And then on BB22, again, another massive target taken out relatively early there. So I feel like that's just kind of an element of Janelle's game that kind of carries with her wherever she goes. And the season felt very similar in that regard, where she did things that elevated her threat level, such as going for shields during missions. That kind of made her kind of sus. You have her like being out in front in terms of who to target, and whenever she missed, it caused people to be like weary of her. And obviously that kind of bites her here, where she is such a massive target, and we see Dan being more than happy to let it happen. And in turn, like, Dan once again beats Janelle at a social strategy game, which is pretty funny. And again, I feel like Janelle was pretty fun to watch here. Again, always fun seeing a Big Brother player here, but obviously she is now out of the game, which is why she's here number 14. And with that, there are 13 players left in the game to talk about, now with the inclusion of Kate. And it's now just a matter of ranking them based on how likely I think they are to win based off their edit and current game position. But number 13, the person I believe is the least likely to win from this point, is still Kevin. And again, I feel like Kevin kind of got more negativity here, where he was one of the more vocal people and wanted to target Janelle, talking about how Janelle's like really sus and that he's been watching her closely. And obviously he was one of the main people taking a swing at her during the roundtable. And obviously that's like kind of putting him out in front. And obviously it's not great that he's shown like being one of the bigger advocates for Janelle when that's very obviously wrong. And considering how much the show seems to be going out of its way to highlight his negative qualities as well as him being wrong, it just makes it feel very unlikely that he's going to win. And it wouldn't shock me if he's targeted soon, where even though people have mostly been regarding him as a faithful, it wouldn't shock me if down the road people are just get fed up with him, or people start to see his actions as being sus to where he could be eventually taken out there. So again, all of it's like pretty bad on Kevin's end, which is why he's here number 13. Now moving on to number 12, and we actually have our new addition to the game, and here we have Kate. And obviously this was Kate's intro, and through that she actually got a decent amount of content here, with her talking about her being bummed that she's not a traitor, and she kind of just comments on a lot of the stuff happening during the roundtable, how she's here to mess things up and that people see her as wild and unpredictable. And we obviously see her after the roundtable, like people catching her up on what's happened so far. And again, it feels like we haven't really seen her integrate much yet. It feels like she is coming off as this outsider during a lot of her time here, though obviously she'll probably integrate more in the following episodes. But again, I feel like if Kate is anything to go by based off her season 1 appearance, I have very little faith in her to actually pull it out by the end of it. I feel like she's probably going to end up being wrong. I could see her getting into arguments, kind of like what she did with Rachel during season 1. And in general, like, I feel like she's someone who's not going to be taken that seriously in the game, considering how season 1 went for her. And even with her content this episode, she's naturally going to get more content due to her being the new arrival, and that she's like this new flashy thing that the show wants to highlight. Though obviously we'll have to see if that carries over into future episodes. But again, I feel like it's a mixture of what we've seen from her so far, and also the fact that we have already seen her play on season 1, which obviously went pretty bad. That makes me feel like pretty low on Kate's overall chances here. Now the main reason I have her above Kevin is I feel like she probably has some longevity with her, as I feel like with her being a low priority, that she'll probably just skate through a lot of the game because of that. I don't really see people going out of their way to target Kate, And I don't really see the traders like utilizing her as a target unless like they just want to create further confusion, kind of like what they did with Tamra. But again, I feel like that's enough to have her above Kevin, who I could legitimately see being targeted soon. But again, it's pretty bad for Kate, which is why she's here number 12. Now moving on to number 11, and we have someone who has dropped quite a bit from last week, and here we have Dan, our first trader on the board. And it's a shame to see Dan fall from grace here, as I feel like this was a mostly bad episode for him, where obviously he had a lot of sus on him coming into this episode, where we saw Janelle coming after him. And while he's able to escape that round, he still gets 5 votes against him. And I feel like with Janelle leaving the game, that takes away a massive shield away from him. And I feel like it will just draw more attention to him coming forward, as his name has already come up once. But even beyond that, he gets some pretty bad content here where he talks about wanting to start playing more aggressively and that he wants to be the one behind this new murder that's about to happen, only for him to fall right into Peter's trap, where Peter had told him, CT and Parvati, that he and Trishelle had the shields and that he should instead focus his efforts on Bergie and Janelle. And obviously with Janelle out of the game, that kind of leaves Dan to go after Bergie. And not only does the episode make it very obvious that Dan will be falling into this trap, but we literally get spoiled on the next time on, which shows us at the next roundtable where Bergie is still there, and everyone that was alive at the end of this past episode will be alive at this next roundtable. So obviously, Dan is going to fall into this trap. It's going to backfire because Bergie has the shield, and obviously this is going to really blow up Dan's game, as now all the eyes will be on him. So obviously all that's very bad, and it's going to leave Dan in a spot that's very tough to recover from. But the main reason I don't have him at the bottom is I feel like the people we already talked about have probably less upside to them compared to Dan. And plus, it is Dan Giesling. He is one of the greatest Big Brother players ever, and we've seen him getting out of tough situations before. And there are some outs that he could turn to here, like he could turn to CT and Parvati and throw them under the bus as a way of getting a traitor out to completely get the target off of him. Again, I do have some faith in Dan as a player to potentially squeak out of this situation, but I'm not going to lie, this is going to be real tough. And it wouldn't shock me if next week we are talking about Dan being taken out of the game here. So again, it's a very tough situation for Dan, and I can't ignore it. So I have him here at number 11. Now moving on to number 10, and we are going back to someone who I was low on before, and I'm still low on them now, and here we have John Burkow. And again, John is someone who I don't have much faith in to actually win the game. I feel like he's been getting a very minimal edit across the season. His only content in this episode comes during the roundtable, where he really leans in on Kevin and like makes it seem like he could vote for Kevin, only for him to vote for Dan, which obviously feels a little weird. Now, obviously, a lot of it is because John seems to be a part of Peter's alliance, which seems to be getting more onto Dan, so it does make sense there, but again, I feel like the show is only showcasing him when it's absolutely necessary, and I feel like with that, it makes it hard to see how he wins the game from this point on, so he's here at number 10. Now moving on to number 9, and we're moving on to another traitor, and here we have Parvati. And obviously Parvati didn't get as much blowback as Dan did for this round, but I still feel like she's not in the best spot here with Dan like getting more of this target on his back, where obviously she does manage to smooth things over with Fedra for the time being, and she is able to go along with the following plan without being suspected, though at the same time, I do worry a lot for Parvati moving forward, where there's already set up to like people potentially turning their backs on Parvati in the future. You had Sandra like doing so in these earlier episodes, and now you have Fedra doing the same thing, where Fedra is talking about how like if Parvati crosses her again, she'll have no choice but to turn on her there. But even beyond that, you have her being on Peter's short list of being a possible traitor along with Dan and CT. And I feel like with Dan in particular, I feel like Dan's main out here is throwing Parvati under the bus, where I feel like Dan will probably recognize like the amount of danger that he's in, and that's probably going to be his highest chance of success, is trying to throw Parvati under the bus, knowing that she's a traitor, and probably with the success of taking out a traitor at the round table, that'll probably take some of the heat off of him as they actually manage to get out a traitor for once. So I feel like that will be a major danger spot for Parvati here if Dan is proactive enough to make that move. So I feel like there's obviously some danger here with Parvati in the short term, but even if she survives here and Dan goes out, I feel like she'll still be in a lot of danger moving forward, given the amount of setup to other people like Sandra and Peter being onto her, and obviously Fedra now. So I feel like with that, it's going to be very hard to see how she actually gets towards the end, which is why she's here at number 9. Now moving on to number 8, and we have another person who could be in some danger in this next episode, but here we have CT. And obviously, the main reason CT could be in some danger is we obviously know that he's on Peter's short list, and that with this plan of taking out Bergie backfiring, that will cause some eyes to turn to CT. And if Dan is proactive enough, he could potentially throw either him or Parvati under the bus. Now, like I said, I feel like Parvati's a bit more likely to be targeted by Dan, given that she actually is a traitor, and that getting up Parvati out would be more effective in taking the target off Dan's back. Though at the same time, I mean, if he doesn't want to be that aggressive, he could possibly just throw out CT there to placate Peter. So again, there is some danger for him here. But even beyond that, I mean, his edit here wasn't particularly great, where he obviously seemed to be suspecting Dan during the breakfast, where he was interrogating him about like getting Dan to give out some names, only for him to later vote for Janelle by the end of it, clearly showing that he's still on Dan's side. So again, it is sort of a weird game to look at with CT, not feeling particularly high on him compared to other people, which is why he's here number 8. Now moving on to number 7, and it's not as if my view of this person went up. If anything, it probably went down a little bit, but I feel like the people below this person went down more in my eyes. But number 7, we do have MJ. And I feel like this was not a great episode for MJ. While she is correct in suspecting Tamra for being the murderer here due to her being an easy target, we later see her abandon her suspicions of Dan and going all in on the Janelle bandwagon, only for her to later vote for Janelle and then admitting to everyone that this was her first mistake. And to me, that one line is a pretty big red flag, as it suggests there are probably going to be more mistakes down the line and that there could be a downfall with MJ in the future. So again, I'm not getting the best vibe from MJ based off that one episode. But again, I feel like the other people either have smaller edits than her or more blatantly set up for downfall soon, which is why she's here number 7. Now moving on to number 6, and we have someone who I have been down on for a lot of the season, and even now, I still don't think they're going to win by the end of it. But number 6, we do have Peter. And again, I still largely stand by what I say about Peter, in that he's a very aggressive player. He's someone who clearly has not been playing the way that he was advertising himself to in episode 1. And again, that dissonance is a red flag in the edit. But I feel like this episode was kind of decent for him, where despite him having this plan that could have backfired, where he tests people like Dan, CT, and Parvati with this false information, it does seem like this plan is going to work, as we literally see Dan planning to murder Bergie, only for it to be deflected by the shield. So again, obviously props to Peter. He's going to get the results that he wants, and that will give him the ammunition to go after Dan, CT, and Parvati in that end. And with Peter being one of the more vocal people with targeting Dan, which is obviously a correct read, I feel like that is a pro to Peter's edit. Though at the same time, I still worry about his long-term prospects, where even if he does get out Dan relatively soon, I do worry he'll be relatively out in front with him being the leader behind a lot of the movements, and that could either get him targeted by the traitors or even make the faithful suspecting him due to him being so far in front, kind of countering the strategy that he lays out of Dan being too quiet. He's just overcompensating by being too loud. So I feel like to that end, that could put Peter into trouble. Then also, Dan could also deflect onto Parvati or CT, which will obviously be bad for him. So again, there are some downfalls with Peter that I could see coming. But again, this was a solid episode for him. And I feel like with other people going down, I do have him here number 6. Now moving on to number 5. And we have someone who admittedly also got a pretty small episode here. And here we have Sandra. And again, her episode here is pretty small. Most of her content comes during the roundtable, where she has her argument with Janelle, which is all pretty funny. And obviously she does ultimately survive here in a spot where they could possibly get a traitor on the next round, which would obviously make things a bit better for her. And plus, I feel like she's a bit more likely to win the battle against Parvati, which would all be pretty good. Again, I still do worry about her long-term prospects. She is someone who is very out in front. I can also see her being targeted by the housewives due to her being like this clear leader for the reality people, even though like they just got out a pretty big target in Janelle. So again, there are some down points I can see with Sandra's game. I feel like compared to the top 4, I'm not as confident with her. But again, I feel like she got a decent enough episode here, even though it wasn't that big, which is why she's here number 5. Now moving on to number 4, we have someone who also got a very quiet episode here, and here we have Sheree, who pretty much got no content here, which is a bit disappointing, and I did quibble about putting her lower on the list because of that. She does also vote for Janelle here, which is part of the majority, though at the same time, she did also vote for Janelle during the max round, so again, she's at least consistent with her reads there, even if they're not necessarily correct, and I do find that a bit underwhelming. Though again, I feel like her lack of content could be a pro here in the sense that she is being wrong, even though she is also voting in the majority. So again, I am a bit unsure about her. But again, I feel like the other people have more red flags in their edits at this point, which is why I do have her here at number 4. Now moving on to number 3, and we have someone very similar to Sheree, and here we have Trishelle. And again, I did debate over whether she's too high here. Again, pretty quiet episode here. Most of her content involves her like winning the shield during the mission. But even beyond that, she is like on the hunt in terms of taking out Dan, which I do think is a pro over Sheree in that she's at least on the right track. She's also shown being in a more solid alliance at this point that is on the right track in taking out Dan here. So again, there are some pros with Trishelle's game position here. Then also, like, she does still have some connections in the game, people like CT, which was highlighted in the last episode. So I do feel like she did enough here to get the edge from me, which is why she's here at number 3. Now moving on to number 2, and it is the same top 2 as last week, though I did switch the order this time. By number 2, we do have Fedra. And again, I still feel like Fedra is the most likely traitor to win, and I feel like with Dan and Parvati being in the positions they are at this point, I would say the gap here has widened a good amount, which is all pretty good for Fedra here. She got her set up with her like being willing to forgive Parvati. However, if she does the same thing again, she'll know Parvati can't be trusted. Obviously, she is given the reins over the murder here, and she does agree to take out Tamra, who is technically a number for her side, as a way of creating confusion. And we do see that being pretty effective here, where she's the only traitor up to this point that has no sus on her, which is all pretty good. We obviously see Dan and Parvati having more attention on them. Even CT has more eyes on him compared to Fedra. Even Kevin has more eyes on him compared to Fedra at this point. Again, I feel like Fedra is positioning herself pretty well, and I feel like it's pretty clear based on the show that she is the most likely traitor to win. However, with the traitors as a whole, like not being in as good of a spot at this point, as obviously we are on the verge of one of them potentially being sniped out, I do worry that does harm Fedra's position to a degree, but I do feel like she did enough here to be here at number 2. And now at number 1, the person I believe is the most likely to win the Traitors Season 2 at this point is Bergie. And I know I've been saying his name wrong these first 2 weeks. Hopefully I fix it this time. And it is kind of weird that Bergie is this high considering he is literally supposed to be murdered in this episode where Dan wants to murder him. And he even agrees to go along with Peter's plan of being put out in front here, being set up to potentially be taken out. But obviously the plan is going to backfire. Bergie has a shield obviously. And we even see in the next time on that Dan does try to murder Bergie, but is unsuccessful there as he's literally at the next round table. And there are literally the same number of people in the game as there were last time. So obviously that all is going to work out in Bergie's favor, his alliance's favor, and obviously that will set them up pretty well to take out one of the traitors here, possibly Dan, though there could be a chance it could be Parvati as well. So obviously all that's pretty interesting. He obviously gets a pretty big presence during the roundtable where he's particularly upset after they fail to get Janelle out, where obviously he was the one to vote for Dan, so again, a correct read there. And he follows it up with a pretty strong confessional afterwards where he says that the traitors did so well by convincing everyone Janelle's a traitor, but now they're all going to avenge Janelle as the faithful. And to me, that was a pretty strong confessional on Bergie's end, and I feel like only highlights his well-rounded edit even more. So again, I feel like there's a lot to like about Bergie from his edit. You also have his game position, which is pretty strong. He's obviously going to be safe in this next episode, and his alliance seems to be on the verge of taking out a traitor here. All that's very good, which is a big reason I do have him here at number 1. And there we go. That'll do it for this week's video. If you like this content, be sure to like and subscribe. It really helps with the channel. And I'll be back again next week to update the Power Rankings again, so you can look forward to that. Obviously, we got Australian Survivor about to start, as well as Hell's Kitchen, so expect weekly content on those shows. I'm on Patreon now, so if you want to consider supporting the channel, you can do so by clicking the link in the description. And you can also join the Discord server by also clicking the link in the description. There's a lot of stuff coming your way, but for now, that is the video. See ya.